Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 265. And this time I'm going to talk about Booker Ervin's, it's not his first, it's one of his first records for Candid, but this is actually a reissue some years later on the specialty reissue label Barnaby. Candid, of course, wasn't around for long, and so trying to find original releases from the period from 1960 to 61 is kind of an expensive habit. But one nice thing about these Barnaby reissues is that you get new liner notes from Nat Hentoff, who, of course, was the original producer. He, of course, is better known as a jazz critic, but he was the Candid producer for a couple of years, in which he's reflecting 10 or 15 years later on the record, including, of course, on Booker Ervin's life, because, of course, Ervin was dead by 1970. In terms of what to expect from this record, and really what to expect from any Booker Ervin record, you get these soaring runs and these extended notes, largely in the higher parts of the register of the saxophone, which gives his music kind of an airier feel than that of his contemporaries, people like Rollins and Coltrane, who had a much blurtier, more muscular sound. I say that affectionately, but it's certainly true. This is also hard bop, which is largely untroubled by the existence at the same time of the new thing, of free jazz and all those contemporary explorations and testings of boundaries. But that's not to say that this is formulaic hard bop, because it's not, and Ervin always had his own distinct voice. Information on Booker Ervin is a little bit hard to come by, and it's not always super reliable on some of the key points in his life. I want to give a shout out here to Stephen Serra's Jazz Profiles website, which by contrast is a consistently good and rich source of information on a number of artists, and Booker Ervin is one of them. Ervin was born on October 31st, 1930 in Denison, Texas. The family enjoyed something approximating a middle-class existence in Denison. They lived on Morton Street. House had a piano. However, he had saxophone fever from an early age, and by all accounts, his primary inspiration was Lester Young. He went to an all-black high school called Terrell High School, which has since been demolished, but you can still find old class photos on the archived website, and here he is playing football. Here he is at age 17 in 1947, but at this stage in his life, he's not doing a ton musically. He's not performing in a significant way. So in 1950, he enlists in the Air Force. This, of course, was during the Korean War, and Ervin's job was as ground crew for the bomber squadrons that were flying over Korea from Okinawa. Began to develop seriously on the saxophone during this point. He left the Air Force in 1953, and then a year later, in 1954, he's got enough to enroll in the Schillinger School of Music in Boston. So he heads off to Boston, embarks in his studies, but unfortunately, he suffers the first of what was a series of bouts of ill health, may or may not have been related to the kidney ailments that eventually took his life. But in any event, he had to withdraw from school. The time in Boston wasn't a total waste, because he spent some time in the clubs and met a number of musicians, including two who would have a major impact on his career in the 1960s, the pianist Jackie Bayard and the drummer Alan Dawson, and he'd make some great records with those guys in the mid-60s. Around the winter of 1954-55, he heads back to Texas, and he gets a job playing with Ernie Fields, who was a band leader who ran a kind of combined R&B, jazz standards, dance band, that kind of thing, which toured around the southern states. The jazz writer Simon Spillett points out that this was about as close as Ervin ever got to being in a big band. It was very typical at that point. It was true of Miles Davis and Coltrane and all kinds of other people to have done your apprenticeship in the big bands before you then went on to the smaller group environment of bebop and hard bop. But Ervin was clear he never really wanted to do that. He felt, probably correctly, that his development of his style, which of course had begun relatively late in life, around the time of age 20, would be stifled if he had to keep playing the same standards the way the band leader wanted them played. In the mid-50s, getting into 56, he's continuing to bounce around. He moves to Dallas, to Chicago, back to Dallas. He then heads off to Denver for 18 months, which is kind of a weird time for him, because on the one hand, he's privately refining his own style of play, but he's also giving serious consideration to giving up music entirely, thinking he might be a dead end. And at that time, he enrolls in studies to become a mechanical draftsman, and apparently had a fair degree of talent. However, eventually, he gives that up and wants to give music another go. Knows he has to go to New York, really, to make things happen, but isn't quite ready to do that, still feels a bit rusty, so he decides the halfway house is to go to Pittsburgh. So he shows up in Pittsburgh in 1957. He's playing the clubs, makes a bunch of contacts, including one very important contact, the pianist Horace Parlan, who was a bit of a fixture in the Pittsburgh scene, and they form a pretty tight musical friendship very quickly, and it had to be quick because Parlan left for New York not long after. Parlan shows up in New York in the late fall of 1957. He checks into his hotel, and he has a chance meeting with Charles Mingus, with whom Parlan had played when Mingus was touring through Pittsburgh, and Parlan had provided local support. Mingus, of course, at this point is running his fantastic jazz workshop. He remembers Parlan, remembers he can play, and offers him some work supporting Mingus in clubs. So Parlan's got work right off the bat, and he cables Ervin and says, look, I think I can hook you up with Charles Mingus. Ervin doesn't need a second invitation. He shows up. Mingus loves his bluesy playing. He loves his expressive and almost trance-like state that he gets into when he's soloing. So, for 3 years, Ervin becomes a key member of Mingus's jazz workshop, and as part of that, he is on a whole string of incredible Mingus records. In fact, he appears on about 10 of those, and some of the real highlights include Mingus Blues and Roots, and Mingus, 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 Mingus. In this time, he also starts a semi-regular group, a quartet, using 3 players who were the regular rhythm section at Minton's Playhouse, which of course had been this legendary bebop venue. And those include Parlan, with whom he was already good friends, George Tucker, the bassist, and Al Harewood, the drummer. That group didn't stay together too long, but they did go into the studio fairly soon to make a record, this record, for Candid. This record's recorded on a winter's day in one session on January 6, 1961. It's produced, as I mentioned earlier, by Nat Hentoff, who was better known, I guess, as the editor of Downbeat through most of the 1950s until there was a bit of a kerfuffle there. He was then the jazz critic for the Village Voice for about 50 years or so until old age. He'd done a little bit of production work with Savoy and Royal Roost in the 1950s, but the lion's share of his production credits are with the Candid label, which he had co-founded with Bob Altshuler in 1960. It only exists, as I mentioned, between 1960 and 61, but he's got something like 30-odd production credits, pretty much all jazz records in that time. The recording session takes place at Nola's Penthouse Studios in New York, which was one of Hentoff's favorite locations, not least because it could be had for $15 an hour. Ervin is on tenor sax, Parlan's on piano, George Tucker's on bass. He's a guy who had trained formally at the New York Conservatory of Modern Music. He'd played with Jackie McLean, he'd played with Coltrane, but primarily his career was associated with being the house bassist at a number of clubs, including Minton's. Behind the drum kit, we find Al Harewood. He never recorded as a leader, but you can find him on about 25 Blue Notes during the classic era of their hard bop releases in the early 60s. Side 1 starts with Mojo, and right away you're introduced to Booker Ervin's distinctive tone. Quite sharp in the higher registers, velvety lower down. Hentoff refers to it as tangy, and I actually think that's kind of a good description. He is also, and it's pretty evident on this track, and maybe because of his background playing in R&B bands and so on, and his grounding in the blues, he's an incredible timekeeper. Overall, I find his playing to be joyous and upbeat. I think that's true of Parlan's solo as well. Interesting side note here that Parlan is actually playing in a different key from the rest of the band. Bit of a change of pace for the next track, Uranus, which is a languorous ballad, a lot of open space in the music. And then we have Poinciana, one of the 2 standards on the record. Parlan is a little more out front here, and he's backed up very solidly by Tucker on bass, who gets his own chance to step out towards the end of the track. Side 2 begins with Speak Low, which is the 2nd standard on the record. This has Ervin giving a performance which is not dissimilar to the kinds of upbeat renditions of standards that Coltrane would deliver in that period, 57, 58, 59. Some of Ervin's critics or commentators, at the time anyway, basically wrote him off as a Coltrane imitator. I don't think that's fair at all. I think his tone and his sound is quite distinct. But if he wanted to sound like Coltrane, which I'm suspecting he might be doing here, he was totally able to do it. The centerpiece of the whole record is the 2nd song on side 2, which is Booker's Blues, which is a full 10 minutes. This begins with a nice little, tasty little bass piece from Tucker, and then you have 5 minutes of really superb, really remarkable improvisation from Ervin. I'm unsure whether after that Parlan or Tucker actually hit the same heights, but regardless, this is a great tune. The record closes with Boo, and this is easily the most technical composition and technical set of changes in the whole record. Ervin is great here, and Parlan, I think, saves his best for last. This record is a good early introduction to Ervin, who of course would go on to greater heights with his book series in the mid-60s. Here, he's clearly the star of the show. He's not yet surrounded by the caliber of players that he would be on his later run on Prestige Records, people like Richard Davis and Jackie Bayard. But nonetheless, there are no weak tracks here, and Ervin's remarkable tone and spectacular soloing, particularly on Booker's Blues, make this one to collect. For me, it's 4 to 5 stars.